Hello. Today we are going to be talking about Matthew chapters 1 and 2. So these are pretty well-known passages. So it can be really tempting to think we already know everything there is to know about these passages because, in particular, they cover the Christmas story. They cover Jesus's beginning. So we can tend to think, oh, I know this story. We know all there is to know about this. But I think that as we go through it, we're going to glean a little bit of extra and grow as we learn. So what I'm going to be doing is going verse by verse or section by section through Matthew chapters 1 and 2. Now, I'll be using the New American Standard Bible. Again, my focus here would be for you to use multiple Bibles because multiple translations are going to come at certain passages a little bit different. So using multiple translations is always going to be your best bet, unless you can go back to the original Greek. And even then, in the original Greek, I would still encourage you to look at multiple translations to confirm that you are reading and translating it correctly. All right, so let's go ahead and start out. Now, if you look at Matthew chapters 1 and 2, and 1 in particular, you'll notice it starts out with a genealogy. So if you look at the first several verses, you'll start here in verse 1, and you'll go down to verse about 17, and you'll see the genealogy of Jesus. Now, the reality is that if we're not careful, our eyes can kind of gloss over, and we can just be like, oh, I can't believe it's a genealogy. I don't want to read a genealogy. And it can be easy for us to skip over the genealogy. But the reality is that when you understand the book of Matthew, and you understand that really this genealogy is key to understanding the points that Matthew is trying to make. So Matthew is most likely writing to a Jewish audience, and he's trying to make the case that Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one of God. In Greek, the word used is Christos or Christ. So Christos or Christ is just the Greek translation of Messiah, the anointed one. So that's really the point that Matthew's trying to make. And it's really important because when he starts out trying to make this point about Jesus being the Messiah, he starts with a genealogy. Because in the Jewish mindset, there's a couple of boxes that have to be checked in terms of connection with Israel. In particular, in order to be the king of Israel, which is what the Messiah ultimately is, then you have to check a few boxes. First thing is you have to be a son of Abraham. You have to be someone who actually is of Israel. And second, you have to be a son of David, someone who is a descendant of David and specifically of the tribe of Judah. So you have these really important tribal identifications that are necessary in order for him to fulfill the role of being the Messiah. So in order for Jesus to be the Messiah, he must be a son of David, and he must be a son of Abraham. So he's got to be from the right family, from the right tribe, from the right nation. And those things are absolutely required in order for him to truly be the Messiah, the anointed one of God, the one promised in the Old Testament. So as we look at Matthew's genealogy, we see him set that up. He says, the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Now, just then, that is a major claim because there have been many other people that have claimed to be the Messiah falsely. So he's making a case. Jesus is not just some guy. He is the anointed one promised from God. Next, he's the son of David, and he's a son of Abraham. Now, this is important because if we look at the genealogy here in Matthew, the genealogy goes back to Abraham, the beginning of Israel, because Matthew is writing to an audience, an Israelite audience, proving that Jesus is the Messiah. If you go and look at Luke's genealogy, you'll notice that it is different. Luke's genealogy goes back to Adam because Luke is making a different connection. Luke is heavily pointing to the broad appeal that Jesus is not just the Messiah for Israel, but the Messiah for the nations. Now, I actually think that Matthew, in a way, is opening the door in a much more subtle way for Jesus being the Messiah to the nations, but not quite the same way that Luke is, because Luke is writing to, most likely, to a Gentile audience, but Matthew is writing to a Jewish audience primarily. So we see, first off, we see, just kind of get the broad strokes of how this goes. We see Abraham is the first one, and then you'll see all the descendants of Abraham, and then all the way down to David. And then you'll see David, and then you'll see all the descendants of David down to the exile, the deportation to Babylon. That's an important part of the history of Israel. The people of Israel were exiled from, well, in particular, the people of Israel, the northern kingdom, were exiled, period. The Assyrians captured them, they exiled them, and they never came back. But the southern kingdom of Judah, you have an exile and a deportation to Babylon. And then there's a coming back, which happens under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. So if you look at that, that's here. So understand, verse 17, in a sense, is a key to what you just read. So when you're reading this genealogy, really verse 17 is your summary explaining that genealogy. So all the generations from Abraham to David, chapters 2 through 6, there are 14 generations. And all the generations from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations. See? 14. And then from the deportation to the Messiah, another 14. So you have a symmetry here. 14, 14, 14. So he's making it a very easy way for you to kind of flesh that out and say, all right, 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. So there's a symmetry that's being found here. From this generation to this generation, this generation to this generation, this generation to this generation. So an important thing to notice here is that, yes, this goes to Abraham, and also, so Abraham is its establishment of, hey, he's a Jew. Then David here shows he's royalty. And then here with Babylon, it shows, and his family made it through the exile and came back and was reestablished here. So he's maintained a bloodline that is still Israelite, still Jewish. So let's look at some highlights in this. And there's a lot of things we could focus on in this genealogy, but one thing that comes out the most as we look at this genealogy is the fact that you have 5 women mentioned in the genealogy. So why is that important? Well, it's important particularly because of which women were mentioned. So first of all, let's kind of rewind a little bit and talk about genealogies in the Old Testament. Typically, genealogies in the Old Testament mostly follow the male line, but not exclusively. You do have examples in the Old Testament where women are mentioned. So it's not unheard of for women to be mentioned. It does happen from time to time. Now, one really important place where you see this happening is not necessarily a genealogy, but it's close to it, and that is in 1st and 2nd Kings, where you actually see each king, you have their father mentioned, and oftentimes you'll have their mother mentioned as well. He was born to this king by this mother. So there in the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, you do see this concept of a woman being mentioned. Often, unfortunately, it's being a woman being mentioned, and it's not a good example. It's a bad king, and in some senses, the shame is brought on the mother because this child is someone who became a bad king. But just to understand, the fact that you have 5 women mentioned here in this section is a little bit unusual, but not totally unheard of. What's actually unusual is which women. Now, if we look at this, the fact that Mary is included is not that unusual. Of course, it makes sense that she would be included. She has a really important role, and this is a setup for the fact that she's going to be born, she's going to be found with child, and she's a virgin. So that's actually really, really important that she's mentioned. But the other 4 women are peculiar. It's weird that they're the ones that are mentioned. Why is it weird? Because it's weird because they're mentioned and not certain other women, right? So why is Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba all mentioned, yet Sarah's not mentioned, Rebecca's not mentioned, Rachel's not mentioned, Leah's not mentioned? These are all really, really important female figures, yet they're not mentioned. Why? At least Sarah. I mean, she's a super important figure. Why are none of them mentioned? And that is something that puzzles us. First of all, women are not super common. They're not unheard of, but they're not super common to mention in genealogies. So when they are mentioned, usually you say, okay, well, why? And then in this particular case, you have 4 women being mentioned to the exclusion of other women that you would think would show up. So what is it about these 4 women in particular that caused our writer to include them? Well, let's look at it. First of all, if we look at Tamar, don't get confused here. This is not the Tamar that was a descendant of David. That would be down here later on if we were talking about her. No, this is the Tamar that was a daughter-in-law to Judah. And Judah ends up marrying one of his sons to her. God strikes down that son. He dies because of his wickedness. And then she marries another one of Judah's sons, which is according to levirate marriage. And then what ends up happening after that is that son dies because of his wickedness. Again, she's got no sons, no children from these 2 men. And Judah has one more son, and he refuses to allow this other son to marry Tamar. So Tamar, who is basically stuck, she needs to marry in order to be secure within the culture. And more specifically, she needs to marry in order to provide an heir for her first husband. Yet Judah is not allowing that to happen. So Tamar actually dresses up in a costume, pretends to be a prostitute, and then she tricks Judah into sleeping with her and getting her pregnant. And then she reveals later on, when she's in trouble for having a child, she reveals, this is Judah, this is your child, which now will legally be your son's child, count as the legal heir to your son. And I did this because you did not do what you were supposed to do. You were supposed to allow me to have another spouse, your son, your other son, but you refused. So I did what it took to make sure that your family line continued on. It's a really, really weird story by our standards. By Jewish standards, actually, Tamar is vindicated. Actually, Judah says to Tamar, you have acted righteously. It's I that's been unrighteous. You were committed to making sure my son had an heir to inherit everything from him. And I was the one that wronged you by preventing you to do your duty. And you made sure that it happened anyway. Again, from our standard, that seems really crazy. But actually, from their standards, that would have been, she's actually seen as being righteous for that. The next one is fairly well known. Rahab. Rahab is pretty well known in that she was a prostitute in Jericho that actually, even though she's a Canaanite, she actually protected the Israelite spies, and as a result, she was allowed to become part of Israel. Ruth is another case. She was a Moabite, so another non-Israelite. She was a Moabite, and what ends up happening with her is she loses her husband dies, and she eventually is going to be able to marry Boaz. She's going to be able to marry Boaz and is able to be brought into the people of Israel by marrying Boaz, and she's going to give birth to Obed, who will eventually have Jesse, who will eventually have David. So she is a great-grandparent of David. So now we get to Bathsheba. Now, Bathsheba is very interesting because Bathsheba is not actually mentioned, which is unique here. She's not mentioned. What's actually mentioned for Bathsheba is that she is, it just says, he fathered Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. So what's interesting here is Bathsheba is not mentioned at all. Uriah is mentioned, the wife of Uriah. So there's this is really a bit of a dig showing, hey, look, just to remind you that David and her relationship started in a very murky way, and Uriah died as a result. So this seems to be a little bit of a reminder of that. And so you have Bathsheba, very much intertwined with Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was not an Israelite. Okay, so let's think about these. Now you have a couple of theories that people have as to why these particular women. One theory is that it's because they all had some sort of sexual sin. Okay, now here's the problem with that particular idea. So it revolves around this idea that they all had sexual sin, and that the point being made here is that God is righteous in saving even those who have deep sin or sexual sin or sin in general. Okay, but here's the problem with that. So you could say that about Rahab. She was a prostitute. And you can sort of say that about Bathsheba in that she was in an adulterous relationship. Now, people argue about how much that was her fault. Okay, we're not going to get into that here. But you really struggle to make this argument for Tamar because Judah says that she's the righteous one. She's actually called righteous. It's actually said that her behavior was actually righteous. She didn't go sleep with some random person. She went and she slept with Judah in order to ensure that Judah's son had an heir. Again, by our standards, kind of crazy. By their standards, she was actually considered righteous. And then Ruth, it's a stretch to say that Ruth is in sin here because Ruth is held up as righteous. There's a couple of scholars that want to make a big deal about Ruth going to Boaz at night, and they want to read into that something sexual happened. But that's not clear in the text of Ruth at all. And the whole point of Ruth is showing that she was righteous. Therefore, David, who descended from Ruth, is righteous. He has a righteous lineage. So that's the struggle there. Another problem with this idea that they were all sinners, therefore that's why they were uniquely mentioned, is because if you look at the males mentioned here, we actually also see kind of a mixed bag here, right? So you have people like Hezekiah, who is pretty positive. You have people here like Josiah, who was pretty positive. Yet you also have people like Manasseh, who is arguably the most wicked king in the history of Judah. You have other kings like Uzziah, who was a pretty good king, but then ended up getting struck with leprosy because of his impiety. Even David is known for his sexual sin of this adultery against and murder of Uriah, which is mentioned here. So it's hard to say that he intentionally mentions these women just because they're known as being particularly sinful or having particular sexual sin. It's a really hard call. Another variation of that view is that each of them has a sordid sexual past, and Mary was about to be accused of having sexual sin because she was about to have a child and as a virgin, and people were going to assume that she did that by having sex outside of wedlock. Again, the problem with that particular view that these four women were setting up that Mary is going to be falsely accused of having sex outside of marriage is, again, it's not at all clear that Ruth's actions were seen as sinful, or that Tamar's actions were seen as sinful, or that there's any sexual sin in Ruth or Tamar. And then it is debatable as to the extent to which Bathsheba had a say in her particular encounter. So what do these four women have in common? What on earth is it that makes them be mentioned? Because of course they didn't have to be mentioned. It could have just been all males here. But you have these four women mentioned. Why these four women? Well, there's another theory, and I actually think this is probably a better one, and that is that there's an attempt to point out the Jewish lineage of the non-Jewish lineage of Jesus. Necessarily, all of these men are Jewish, yet these women, it seems like these women in particular, are actually not Jewish. So Tamar, you have a Jewish tradition that's very strong. You see it going back to several hundred years, down to 300 and 400s BC, several hundred years before Matthew is writing this. And then you see it also being written about at the time of Matthew. You have this strong Jewish tradition saying that she is Syrophoenician or Aramean, that she's from the area of Syria or Aram. And that is a very strong tradition. So it seems highly likely that as far as Matthew was concerned, Tamar was non-Jewish. We know that Rahab was non-Jewish. She was a Canaanite. Ruth was a Moabite, also non-Jewish. And the very fact that Bathsheba was married to Uriah the Hittite, which is actually emphasized here. The fact that she's married to Uriah is emphasized in the way this is worded, also emphasizes her non-Jewishness. The fact that she's married to a Hittite probably means that she was not Jewish. And at the very least, the fact that Uriah is mentioned rather than Bathsheba directly is mentioned, it points to her connection to the Hittites, not to the Jews. So an argument here, which I think of the arguments best fits, an argument here is that these four women are mentioned because it's pointing to the fact that Jesus is not only coming to the Jews, but also to the Gentiles. And again, that actually is a really, really important point when you think about Matthew's Jewish audience. He's writing about the Jewish Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. But he's also showing that within Israel, there has always been room for Gentiles to enter the fold. And that Jesus, as the Messiah to Israel, is also the Messiah for the Gentiles. And that will actually be something that plays out more later. So let's skip down. Let's move beyond this point of just the genealogy. And let's look deeper at what is written here. So now the birth of Jesus, verse 18, the Messiah was as follows. When his mother Mary had been betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be pregnant by the Holy Spirit. Now, I want you to understand the way marriage worked in the ancient world. You would have this period of betrothal. So you would be connected with that woman. And for all intents and purposes, at that point, you were essentially married to her. It's like what we would think of as an engagement. But the reality is at that point, she is effectively, in a real sense, your wife. You're betrothed. She's promised to you. Yet that marriage is not really inaugurated until the wedding. So you are to be loyal to each other, to be connected to each other, as if married, until you're going to have that wedding, and that's when it's consummated. Well, what we see happening here is we see this betrothal happening. They entered this period of being promised to each other, being really effectively married, though not actually consummated yet. And then she gets pregnant. Well, there's only one explanation for this, because in the ancient world, just like today, we know where babies come from, right? So the answer here is, well, she's pregnant, and Joseph is saying, well, we haven't done anything that should get her pregnant, therefore she must be unfaithful, because we know where babies come from, right? So then her husband, notice he's called her husband here, okay? They're betrothed, he's called her husband. Again, that's because of that unique situation. So the marriage is not consummated yet they are effectively husband and wife at this point. Since he was a righteous man and did not want to disgrace her, he planned to put her away secretly. Basically, he didn't want to hurt her. He did not want her to have the consequences that she could have if it came out that she had committed adultery and that she had been promiscuous. But when he had thought this over, behold, an angel appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child who has been conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. She will give birth to a son, and you shall name him Jesus, and he will save his people of their sins. Now, I want you to notice a couple things. One, Joseph is referred to as the son of David. That means that he is of the royal tribe. He is of the royal family. And anyone born to him will be of that royal kingly lineage. Okay? Again, lineage and descent really matters. Who your ancestors were really matters in this culture. Next, I want you to notice the dream. You're going to see this pop up several times in the next two chapters. Dream will pop up a lot. So notice how much God communicates through dreams in this section. Next, let's go down here to 22. Now, all this took place so that what was spoken through the Lord, by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Behold, the virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel, which is translated God with us. Then Joseph awoke from his sleep and did as the angel of the Lord commanded, and took Mary as his wife, but kept her a virgin until she gave birth to a son, and named him Jesus. So I want you to focus in on this particular prophecy, Behold, the virgin will conceive. Now, this actually goes back to Isaiah. This is an important passage in Isaiah. And here's the struggle. In Hebrew, the word here in Hebrew can mean virgin, but it also can just mean young woman. It can just mean young woman. It doesn't have to mean virgin. Now, there's a Greek translation of the Old Testament that translates it as virgin, so it could be seen that way, a word that's more unambiguously virgin. But the Hebrew word is ambiguous. It could mean a virgin, but it could also just mean a young woman. So that has led some scholars to argue that this is actually Matthew misunderstanding the Old Testament, that Matthew has misunderstood or mistranslated this. He took a passage that in the context referred to a young woman, not a virgin, and now he's applied it to Mary, who is a virgin. And specifically, people will go back to that passage and say, in the context of that passage in Isaiah, it's not actually referring to a future child being born. It's referring to a child that's born there in the book of Isaiah. And the reality is that that is true. This seems to be an example of a passage that has a double fulfillment, or at the very least, it had a single fulfillment, but now it's being used as an example for precedent. Hey, God's worked like this before, and now he's going to do it again. Okay, so let me break that down a little bit. So the argument goes that there in Isaiah, you have this person, you have this prophecy of a young maiden is going to have a child, and that child is going to be basically a sign of what God is doing. And then in Isaiah, that happens. We actually see the fulfillment of that. So the argument goes that that fulfillment happened, and now later, 700 or so years later, you see God reusing it. It's a second fulfillment. He had always intended it to have two meanings. That's one argument here. Another argument, which I think might be a little stronger here, is that what's going on is, yes, that was fulfilled at that time, but in this particular case, you have basically a bit of an echo. You see God saying, hey, look at what God did then. Well, God's going to do something similar now, but he's going to take it even a step further. He's not just going to have a young maiden give birth to a child of significance. He's going to have a virgin give birth to this child of significance. So it's not a double fulfillment, but it's more of an echoing. It's more of a God kind of echoing these ideas. So this can be complicated, and you have some other theories about this particular passage. You'll notice that it is a pretty controversial passage here. So, behold, the virgin will conceive. You know, even though you might get confused about how this shows up in Isaiah, here in Matthew, it's clear that he's talking about a virgin. The Greek word used here clearly denotes a virgin, and the context shows that we're talking about a virgin. That's what the context really points to here. She hasn't had sex, yet she has a child. And it's the Holy Spirit that has caused this miracle to happen. So this is a virgin birth. So let's move down further and see. So she's going to have this child, and notice he's going to keep her a virgin. They are not going to consummate the marriage. Now, we do know later that they will consummate that marriage and they will have children, such as James and Jude, both people who have written books of the New Testament. So we do know that we are going to see Joseph and Mary have other children later, but Joseph, while he raised Jesus and he's effectively the adoptive father of Jesus, he is not biologically the father, because God, the Holy Spirit, is the one who caused Mary to conceive in a miraculous way, not a sexual way, but in a miraculous way. So now let's look at chapter 2. Moving on. So now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah, or of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him. Now, this is really important. I want you to grasp this. Notice the contrast here. Herod the king. Yet they're asking for who? For whom? The King of the Jews. So you immediately see a conflict of interest here. Herod, who has been appointed king by the Romans. This Herod, who's been appointed king by the Romans, who is king over all of Judea. All of a sudden, he hears they're asking about the person who's been appointed the King of the Jews, which is a messianic title, the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And all of a sudden, this affects Herod. Now, this is going to affect Herod. We're going to read down a little further and you'll see it. But the main reason to understand that this affects Herod is that Herod is the king of the Jews, but he's not actually Jewish. He's an Idumean. So he's of a group of people who live nearby, but they are not ethnically Jewish, although they converted to Judaism many generations earlier. So he's not ethnically Jewish, but religiously, at least to a degree, he is Jewish. The reality is that Herod played both sides. You know, he would play up pagan stuff when it would help him. So I would not consider him a true religious Jew, but he basically passed as a religious Jew. He technically converted to Judaism. So we have this guy who's really a usurper. He's not a son of David. Now notice, how does Jesus's genealogy start? He's a son of David. Even the humble carpenter, even this humble carpenter, Joseph, is a son of David. He has the right to be a king of Judah more than Herod does. Why is Herod a king of Judah? Because might makes right. Basically, Herod's family has been put in this position of leadership because they had the ability to make things happen politically on the ground, so the Romans made them the kings. So now you have this very paranoid king. He's very paranoid of like somebody's going to come around and try to take his position. And now these magi from the east arrive. Now, I want you to know who magi are. Sometimes they're called wise men. And the picture is that this is a group of people who are like magicians and astrologers and fortune tellers and philosophers that were really common out in the East, around Babylon or Persia. So the idea is that now these guys, who are usually respected to a degree, they're a little bit respected, they're a little bit feared, they're seen, and in some senses in a good light, but in some senses in a negative light, as being people who kind of mess with magic that maybe we shouldn't mess with. They mess with astrology and understanding where the stars are. And they use this understanding of the stars and the heavenly celestial bodies in order to understand history and time and all these things, right? So these magi, who are really astrologers, see a star that confirms the Jewish Messiah is coming, right? So we have this interesting picture of these guys who are seen as you don't really kind of tangle with the magi. They're interesting. They're someone to be feared and to be listened to. And they are saying, hey, a Jewish Messiah is being born like now. So this is going to lead to fear because, again, as we've established, Herod is fearful of his kingdom. He's very paranoid. He's actually eventually going to kill some of his sons because he's afraid that they're going to take away his position. And so we see Herod being very paranoid about losing his throne. And then these wise men, these magi, come along and they say, hey, there's a usurper, there's a king, and God has anointed him, and we know he could come in any minute. So now we see then Herod, when Herod, the king, heard this, he was troubled. Yeah, he was very troubled, right? Understandably so, because you have this context of him being a usurper and of astrologers or magi being seen as people who really knew things. So all Jerusalem with him. Now, why is all Jerusalem scared with him? Well, because when Herod is mad, or when Herod is scared, you better get scared because people start dying. A lot of people die because they got on Herod's wrong side. And gathering together all the chief priests and the scribe and the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they said to him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For from you will come forth a ruler who will be a shepherd to my people Israel. So we identify that Bethlehem is where he's going to be born. So yes, that is actually where he's born, Bethlehem. Again, this is another tie-in to King David, because where was David from? Bethlehem. So again, this is a tie-in to David. And what's very interesting is we have Jesus, who is a son of David, Jesus, who is born in the place, the city of David, the place where David was born. Jerusalem is sometimes called the city of David as well. But the place where David was born and raised, Bethlehem, and he has much more of a right to be king when you compare him to Herod, who's a usurper. So now, then Herod secretly called the Magi and determined from them the exact time that the star appeared. Okay, now this will become important later. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go, search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come to worship him. And after hearing the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star, which they had seen in the east, went ahead of them until they came and stopped over the place where the child was found. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. Now, notice it did not say that they went to Bethlehem. That's important. We don't actually know if at this point they were in Bethlehem. We don't know. That's not what it says, because he says, go to Bethlehem. But then it doesn't say they go to Bethlehem. It says, and then they saw the star move again and they followed the star. So just understand, let's not read into it. It doesn't say they went to Bethlehem. It says they followed the star and they ended up where he was. Now, if we look further, we see, then they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly. And after they came to the house, they saw the child with his mother, Mary. So now he's in a house. He's not at this point in a barn. Or some would say that it's not technically a barn. It's more of like a lower room that would be part of a house where the animals would be kept. So that's one distinct possibility there. But that's not what they are. They're in a house. They seem to be in a general house area. So again, that actually indicates that some time might have passed. This might not be him as a baby. So after they came into the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they fell down and worshiped him. And then they opened their treasures and presented to him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And after being warned by God in a dream They did not return to Herod. The Magi left to their own country by another way. So another important thing here is we see 3 gifts: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Another thing to notice, we don't actually know how many wise men there were. People often say there are 3 because gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but actually no. That there's nothing that says how many there were. There may have been 1. Probably not, because they're plural. May have been 2. Maybe, but it's a lot of traveling with just 2 people. There may have been 3. There may have been 10, 20, 30. We actually don't know how many of these magi or wise men there actually were. The Bible just doesn't tell us. Now, these things, gold, frankincense, or myrrh, were all things that were quite expensive and worth a lot of money. Obviously gold, but then also frankincense and myrrh were quite valuable and important. Some people will argue that these are connected with the fact that he's going to die one day, because frankincense and myrrh could be used in burial ceremonies. That's not 100% tied at this point, but these would have been expensive, very expensive things. So they worship him, or at the very least, they bow down to him and they show homage to him as a king. So we have this kingly imagery here. And then ultimately they're warned in a dream. There's that word again. We saw Joseph was warned in a dream earlier. Now they're warned in a dream. So then we're going to see here, now when they had gone, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. That's the 3rd dream in this kind of 2-chapter section. That's the 3rd dream. So this is a big deal. Get up, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and stay there until I tell you. And then Herod is going to search to kill him. So Joseph got up, he took the child and his mother while it was still night, and they left for Egypt. And he stayed there until the death of Herod. And this happened so that what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet would be fulfilled. Out of Egypt I called my son. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged, and he sent men and killed all the boys that were in Bethlehem and all its vicinity, who were 2 years old or under, according to the time which he had determined from the Magi. So this seems to indicate that Jesus could have been possibly as old as 2 at this point. There's no guarantee, but based on when they first saw the star to this point, 2 years seems to have passed. So at this point, Jesus could have been as much as 2. That's not clear though. But let's look at this thing. I wanted to read the whole thing together because I want you to pick up on something. And that is that Matthew seems to be making a deliberate comparison between Moses and the people of Israel, the story in Exodus, and Jesus. And this is the theme that you're actually going to see throughout this whole book, where actually Jesus is going to be put up as not only the Messiah, but as someone who is greater than Moses. So where are we getting this from? How do we see the comparison between Moses and Jesus? Well, first of all, I want you to notice what's happening here. Notice you have a wicked king, okay? A wicked king. And that wicked king, what does that wicked king do? He wants to kill all the young boys. Does that sound like Pharaoh to you? Yes, that's a lot like Pharaoh. You have a wicked king, and he ends up killing all of these Israelite boys. Next, what do we have? We see the people of Israel. We see God's people, or Jesus as a representative of God's people, having to flee. But here's the difference. In the case of Israel, in the case of Exodus, and Moses, what they end up doing is they ultimately flee Egypt to go to the nation where the promised land. They flee Egypt to go to the promised land. So the wicked king is in Egypt, but they get safety by going to the promised land. Well, now what do we see? We see the reverse. There's a wicked king where? The wicked king is in Israel, in the promised land. And where do they have to flee to get to safety? Egypt. So you're supposed to look at this and you're supposed to say, what has happened? If we look at Exodus, Egypt is the place where we fled to get away from danger and captivity. Now, look how far things have fallen. That there is a Pharaoh in Israel ruling with the same level of wickedness that Pharaoh in Egypt ruled. And now the only safe place for God's own anointed king is Egypt. See, Matthew seems to be really making a deliberate point here. You have the chosen one who represents all Israel fleeing to Egypt, not out of Egypt. And then ultimately, what ends up happening? What's going to end up happening is you're going to have this king try to kill all these boys. And ultimately, what's going to happen is they're going to leave and they're going to go back to Israel after he dies. So there's this picture of they stay until his death, and the angel is going to come to Joseph and is going to say to Joseph, hey, Joseph, he's died. But when Herod died, an angel appeared to Joseph in a dream and says, get up, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel, for the one who sought his life is now dead. Now, if you read Exodus, that's very similar language to saying, to when God says to Moses, go back to Egypt because the one who sought your life is now dead. It's safe now. You can go. So again, even there, you have this language. So you have the chosen one of Egypt, of Israel, has to flee to Egypt to get safety and has to be told when it's safe for him to go back, which is very similar to the book of Exodus, but it's flipped on its head. Now you have this phrase, out of Egypt, I call my son. So we see when you see that in the Old Testament, it's the people of Israel being led out of Egypt. Well, now we see Jesus as the representative of Israel being led out of Egypt to go back. So I hope that as you look through this, you'll see these very clear parallels with the Old Testament and with Exodus in particular. So now, and this very last part, we see Joseph is actually going to go back. So Joseph got up, he took the child and his mother, and he came to the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus, this is Herod Archelaus, this is Herod the Great's son, Herod Archelaus, was reigning over Judah in the place of his father, he was afraid to go there. Now, Archelaus is we actually know about him from external history, and he's bad. Like he's so evil, so wicked, such a bad and harsh ruler that he's actually going to end up being removed from power by the Romans and replaced with a Roman governor. So that's how bad he is, that even the Romans are like, wow, man, too much. Back it up now. You're way too mean. That's a pretty extreme rebuke there. And then finally, we see he's warned in a dream, another dream. So we see a lot of dreams happening here. And then finally, after being warned in a dream, we see he's going to go back to Jerusalem. And actually, we missed one dream there. We saw him warned in a dream that he could go back. But now, instead of going to the area around Bethlehem or Judea or Jerusalem, he's going to go to Nazareth, which is going to become important because Jesus is going to be a Nazarene in that sense, not in the sense of taking the Nazarite vow, but in the sense of being from Nazareth. So I hope that as we've gone through this, you can get a kind of good picture of everything. This is not every single detail, but I leave it to you to go and do your own research to learn more about this really important section within the book of Matthew.